Hello, this is 42nd Parallel. I'm Georgi Grimradze, and I'm delighted today to be joined by the analyst, very prominent analyst of international relations, and the best and a good friend of ours, the good friend of our program and good friend of mine, Lasha Kasradze. Lasha, hello. Thank you so much for joining me on this program today.
How are you?
And I'm delighted. This is really very fascinating that we have a very distinguished guest, as I know. And please present him. Please introduce him.
Yes, thank you so much. I am glad to be back with you, George. This is great. Just like you said, we are both very delighted to have Lord Skidelsky on the Georgian public broadcasting for the first time. This is going to be a fascinating interview and analysis that we hope and are confident your audience will enjoy. As I said, today we are joined by Lord Skidelsky, Professor of International Relations and then Political Economy, Warwick University, between 1987 and 2007. Mr. Skidelsky is best known for his biography of the economist John Maynard Keynes, which received many prizes, this work. He was elevated to the House of Lords back in 1991 for his scholarly and political work, and served as shadow minister for culture, media, sport, and economic affairs between 1997 and 2001. Since 2021, Mr. Skidelsky has emerged as a strong critic of British policy towards Ukraine, advocating a negotiated end to the conflict. And with that, I'd like to dive into the current problems that we're all facing in the international system and have Lord Skidelsky give us his profound analysis on the current affairs, the brouhaha that we are witnessing in the international system. I think we will be all better for it. Lord Skidelsky, once again, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Lord Skidelsky, thank you so much for joining us.
And are you going to start off with asking me a question?
Yes, definitely.
George, would you like to go first, or would you like me to do that?
Yeah, please. First question for you. Yeah.
Sure. So let me just start from the overall change in the international system, how you look at it. We have shifted from unipolarity to the multipolar world. This is basically the consensus now among the experts and the scholarly community within the field of international relations. And that affected a whole lot of things. That affected regional politics, not just in the South Caucasus, but we'll get to that in a second. But what is your take? Where is the world headed? Just to sort of start it off as an overall view that you may have about this change. We have Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We have the Trump administration that is engaged in economic nationalism. How do you see these changes? Are they compatible with the current sort of multipolar system? And do you think sort of this is the last gasp of liberal internationalism and sort of the neoconservative world order?
Well, those are very important and difficult questions. Yes, we're shifting to multipolarity. We're shifting from the notion of a world which is really run by a single power, the United States, to one in which there's a much more equal distribution of power. And that reflects the weakening of the United States relative to other centers of power. And that, in turn, is the problem Trump faced. I mean, the weakening has been economic and geopolitical, and the two are closely connected. America hasn't got any longer the resources unilaterally to be the policeman of the world and to dictate the law of the world. It can't do it. And in trying to do it, it's actually been weakened. So America's run a continuous current account deficit on its balance of payments. So that's the economic bit of the situation that Trump is trying to resolve by putting tariffs everywhere in order to correct the American trade deficit. But of course, that also conflicts with some of his geopolitical objectives, which are to make deals with Russia and China. So there's a conflict at the heart of American policy at the moment between getting America balanced economically and also making agreements with other countries to secure a peaceful world. I think that's a contradiction. I mean, I don't think it's Trump's fault. This was an inherent contradiction. That's where it is at the moment. And so, you know, you have this question that he wants to talk to Putin to end the Ukraine conflict, but at the same time he's threatening him with threatening India with big increases in tariffs because he doesn't want India to buy Russian gas. You see, so I mean, there's a conflict there, but that's just the surface of it.
So Lord Skidelsky, you mentioned a very important part about this, the bringing the tariffs for India, for instance, the sanctions, the secondary sanctions on India regarding the buying the Russian gas and oil and etc. So what is the end game in that regard for the Trump? I mean, yes, we do understand that the unipolarity has somehow ended, but the multipolarity is still uncertain. What kind of multipolarity we will have? This is uncertain. And what is the Trump's end game in this regards? I mean, is he trying to remain unipolar policeman? I mean, is he trying to keep United States as a unipolar policeman in the world, or he is understanding that multipolarity is unavoidable?
Well, I think you know, it's a big moment of realization for a hitherto imperial country that it's no longer strong as it was before. So, of course, he wants to get the best of all possible worlds. You know, he wants multipolarity, but he also wants multipolarity on American terms, so to speak. And he's still got a lot of leverage. What's the end game? He wants a Nobel Peace Prize.
Okay. Is that everything for the Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the end game. And in order to get a Nobel Peace Prize, you've got to actually produce some peace, or at least be rewarded for your efforts in that direction. I'm not as critical of Trump as many people are. I mean, you know, there's one genuine thread running through the whole of Trump's political career, and it starts long before the Ukraine war. He hates killing. He keeps saying, I want to end the killing, in every sentence almost that he devotes, every speech he devotes to international relations. He talks about ending the killing. Now, I think that's genuine. And it's something that we in Britain don't really understand any longer, that idea that peace is the most important thing. I mean, we're very happy for Ukraine we're very happy to wage a proxy war against Russia via Ukraine, and the amount of people that get killed in that, it's now maybe hundreds of thousands in killed and wounded in the last 4 years. Doesn't seem to concern us, but it does concern Trump, and that's the good and genuine part of Trump. He wants a peaceful world, but he also wants somehow America to be in some controlling position in that world, and that is maybe the inconsistency in his policy.
Okay, Lasha, please join our discussion about that.
one of the first things I wanted to say was what Lord Skidelsky, he just beat me to it when every time Trump comes out and talks about saving human lives. I do want, and then we're talking about him, his aspirations to get the Nobel Peace Prize. And I wonder if that's the reason why he keeps emphasizing this. But let's give the man the benefit of the doubt and say that, he does believe truly and genuinely that these lives have to be saved. And this was a senseless war, and that all of this could have been avoided. Um, I believe that. I want to believe that. His instinct, this is not a warmonger president, correct? He's
Correct.
not, he does not come from your traditional sort of neoconservative, neoliberal establishment in Washington. Then that's why one can argue this is one of the biggest reasons why he became the president of the United States, was because, the population, his electorate at least, was sick and tired of this senseless adventurism that was costing U.S. both strategically, materially, in terms of finance, more than it was gaining from it. And just a quick note on that, I think U.S. Wasted its unipolar moment on these adventurisms, and I think one of the biggest reasons for it was its paranoia of maintaining the primacy of NATO, of sort of finding the reason for NATO's existence after its victory in the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But be that as it may, yes, I join you all in the idea that this is something that it's a last-ditch effort, I would say, of the liberal internationalist West. If you look at what Europe's been doing, I think there is no doubt that Europe continues with this same rhetoric, empty rhetoric. They don't know what to do with themselves, if I can put it in those terms. They're on the one hand, they have to bandwagon with the United States. And then on the other hand, they hate Russia. They want to act strategically independently from the United States, but they can't really pull that off either. So I think the West is in turmoil now. And guess what? I think America, China, and Russia will be the three major powers that will come out of this as winners. What will happen to Europe? Where will Europe end up strategically in this strategic triangle? I don't know. Europe has been weakened as a result of their ideological fanaticism, if you will, mainly, to a large extent encouraged by Washington, correct? To a large extent, this is based on promises that somehow, United States would provide a security umbrella, for Ukraine against Russia, and it would use the European, the Western Europe, efficiently to reach that goal. But it hasn't worked out that way. I think Europe is the weakest.
Yeah.
Let's. I think so. This is. I don't have a question. I'm just making a comment here. Yeah. So perhaps you could just respond.
Yeah, let's go back in history a little bit. I mean, there was this moment, wasn't there, in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union had collapsed and the world seemed to be open to the West. There was going to be one civilization, one international economy, and one world order. That was, some of us call it the Fukuyama moment, in honor of the Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a very influential article in 1989 called The End of History. So there was an opportunity there, but I think the West squandered it because Russia's place in this new order was not sufficiently determined. This was a moment when Russia was very weak, when it seemed you could just incorporate Russia into a Western-based system without any Russian input into it, really. And above all, I think insufficient attention was paid to Russia's security concerns. The Russians regard Gorbachev as having betrayed them, really, by not getting the Americans to sign up to a promise not to expand NATO eastwards. I mean, this was a promise given to Gorbachev, but he never insisted that it become a treaty. And so what the Russians felt was a gradual eastward expansion of an alliance that was, in its essence and in its beginning, an anti-Russian alliance. So it incorporates not only the old protected states in Eastern Europe, but also then the Baltics. And then the next goal is Ukraine. And to some extent, Georgia as well. These were regarded as, I think, by most Russian opinion, as the last sort of buffers against, NATO coming straight at their frontiers. And the West were very indifferent to that. Were they indifferent to Russian security concerns, or was there a definite project to detach these last border countries from Russia, incorporate them in NATO, and thus establish a hegemony over the Eurasian heartland, which was an old geopolitical dream of the West? I mean, so I think the Russians felt betrayed by the West, felt betrayed by their own leaders like Gorbachev, and this is the way they responded. As soon as they got some strength back, they were going to fight this. And this fight back really became apparent in a speech made by Putin in 2008, the year in which NATO said Ukraine would become a member. And he makes this speech saying, we can't accept this. And from that moment onwards, the unipolar moment, the one moment which seemed to be opened up by the collapse of the Soviet Union, collapsed. And it's been mounting tension ever since, with Russia, in its own eyes, and I to some extent accept that, fighting a defensive action against this encroachment, as they see it. Of course, the West doesn't accept that story at all. They simply regard it as a set of Putin fabrications, paranoia, and so on, because to them, and I've had this said to me many, many times, NATO is a purely defensive alliance. It has no territorial ambitions. And then people say, well, what about Iraq? What about Libya? What about Kosovo? Is this purely defensive? So coupled with NATO hard power has been the idea of regime change, using the hard power to get changes in regime favorable to the Western ideas. And that, of course, means an increase in Western power. I mean, and people have fought against it, Russia, China, and the BRICS. So they don't accept this idea that the future lies in a universal acceptance of Western values and Western interests.
So, Lord Skidelsky, so I think about that. Commenting on Witkow's visit, Trump mentioned that there is the possibility of the progress. I mean, this visit about 2 days ago.
Possibility of what? Sorry.
A possibility of progress. I mean,
yes.
He highlighted that there is the possibility of progress. I mean, Trump.
Who did?
Trump,
Who did?
Trump highlighted.
Trump. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and actually there was some kind of insights that Witkov was provided some kind of vision from the Russian side about the outcome of the conflict. So my question is, how much Trump understands Russia's concerns? I mean, on the Western political elite, contemporary Western political elite, they do, how to say that they do ignore Russia's concerns about the NATO enlargement. But what about Trump? How much he understands these concerns, how much he can respond to these concerns, and how much he is free of the local U.S. political elite to act adequately to these concerns?
Well, I think you've made one very important point. I mean, Trump isn't a dictator.
Yes.
I mean, he is a president, a very powerful president, but there's a constitution and there is an opposition. He has to take an opposition often within his own administration. Which he has to take into account. That doesn't seem to be the position of Putin. I mean, Putin is much more in control, I feel, of Russian policy than Trump is of American policy. So whatever Trump believes to be the case, he has not got supreme power to make his ideas effective. I mean, that's the first point. On the security point, Trump seems to understand this. When he talks about the Ukrainian war being an unnecessary war, he implies that the security concerns of Russia could have been met. And now I think he accepts the fact, and the administration accepts the fact, that there's going to be no expansion of NATO towards any further expansion of NATO to Ukraine. So in that sense, he has accepted the security concern, and the neutrality of Ukraine is one of the conditions of of a peace. What he doesn't understand, I think, is the strength of Russian feeling about what they call the Nazification of Ukraine by the Western nationalist element, the Galician Ukrainian bit. And so I don't think he understands, he thinks that these territorial questions can be sort of parked to one side. Then you have a ceasefire, of course, and then normality starts. But I don't think he understands that for Putin, the solving of the Russian Donbass and Crimean issue is part of the settlement. They can no longer be part of Ukraine, in Putin's view, and I think in the view of the Russian foreign policy establishment. That he has not accepted. And that is the barrier, I think, at the moment, to a ceasefire. I mean, what the Russian president is saying is this question of Donbass and the future of the Russian-speaking bits, ethnic Russian bits of Ukraine, has to be settled in advance of a ceasefire. Otherwise, we'll have a ceasefire and then United States will simply rearm Ukraine and to start the war again. Whereas the West has a completely different view. They say, this is the Europeans, have a ceasefire and that'll give Putin the chance to rearm and start the war again. So what you get out of this is a profound lack of trust. There is no trust. I mean, the Russians don't trust the Western policy-making establishment, and the Western policy-making establishment don't trust the Russians. Now, somehow you've got to break that. I think adults can break it. I think people who genuinely want to make peace, who are pragmatists, can break this through this barrier. But it's very tough, and this is what diplomats used to be for. I mean, one time this was why you had diplomats, in order to break through barriers created by the political leaders and talk your way to peace under them somehow. And we don't seem to have that ability any longer. Perhaps it's coming back, but I don't see it in Western Europe, and I don't even see it in Russia. I mean, I think I'd like to see more give in the Russian position than they have at the moment.
Lasha, any comments on that?
Sure. I think I'll just go back to the whole issue of trust. I think we should also be realistic and assume and think of it this way, that there was truly a naivete in the early 90s, let's just say during the Clinton administration, that Russia would not be upset with the expansion of NATO, that everything was, that the history was over, and that, the idea that the zone of peace, democratic peace, would expand, backed by NATO, in their minds, was supposed to be something that Russia was sort of not only go along with, but he'd be happy about. And so there was some sort of a naivete there. I believe that within the West and within the United States. Fast forward to today, what Lord Skidelsky just alluded to, the trust issue. I think at this point, that naivete has long been gone, and I think now it's very purposeful, what the West is doing. When we talk about the ceasefire was just an empty phrase. I think ceasefire really meant nothing. It was a marketing campaign for the Trump administration, because the fundamentals, just like Lord Skidelsky addressed it a few minutes ago, were not addressed for Russia. And those fundamentals have always been no NATO, neutrality for Ukraine, and all the four oblasts were going to become part of Russia. By the way, all of that could have been avoided, but that's a different story. And now that Russia is winning this war, obviously has an upper hand, even though the Kremlin is more than willing to preserve bridges and not burn bridges, especially with Washington, and come up with some sort of a solution to this. Diplomatic solution, even though I believe that this has to be ended with a military solution. But I think in terms of trust, the trust is when Lord Skidelsky mentioned that Europe looked at there are two sides of the same coin. Europe sort of saying that this ceasefire cannot be trusted. Well, of course it cannot be trusted, because you're doing the exact opposite of what Putin is asking. You're basically going at it from the fundamentally different point of view, sort of a non-starter. That's your attitude. And they know perfectly well, that's my point. The point I'm trying to make is that they know perfectly well what Putin wants for this to end. And yet they're playing these games where the collective West is sort of blaming Russia for spoiling the deal, when there is no deal that the West is offering. And I think Trump is caught in between these two.
I agree.
I think Trump understands perfectly well what Putin wants. And in my personal view, he couldn't care less. He could have given half, eastern Ukraine to Putin instinctively, on a personal level. He's such a pragmatic, transactional president that he understands exactly what Putin wants, and he cannot fathom the idea of spoiling this deal over some four oblasts, right? That he's probably couldn't point out on a map. But because of this, sort of conspiratorial, if you will, ideological approach to this whole process, I think he's caught in between. And my fear is that he will be dragged into this sort of neoconservative and neoliberal establishment deeper and deeper, just like he has been, let's just say, with Israel vis-a-vis Iran. So we're far from being out of the woods yet. That's my point here.
I agree, but I think also Putin has to realize this. He has to give something as well, because otherwise he faces the failure of all these peace initiatives, and then the considerable reinforcement of Ukraine as a consequence of that. So that, what he faces, unless he gives something soon, is that Ukraine will be increasingly rearmed with increasingly lethal weapons able to hit Russia. So there is some pressure on Putin, which can be exerted. There's also some pressure that might be exerted on him to give something by China. China we haven't talked about, but China is a key element in any deal here. Any deal has to be really guaranteed by China as well. If you can get a Congress of that kind, of China, Russia, the United States, European Union, to draw up or agree on some kind of global security system, then you will have solved the Ukraine problem and many other problems. But that's not there yet. And so it'll be very interesting to see what happens as a result of this latest meeting between the Russian president and Putin's representative in Moscow, which took place yesterday. I don't know. I haven't seen what the results are, but they say they say the talks were constructive.
Okay, let's take them for their word. Just very briefly, I just wanted to make a comment. I absolutely agree with you that in the long term, this is not just one way for Putin, correct? Yes, he's got an upper hand militarily in Ukraine, but in the the longer this war continues, the less strategically beneficial it becomes for Putin, I think. And if China loses its interest, or if China starts to feel like it's paying a high price, a much higher price vis-a-vis its relationship with the West or the United States, then it's not. Although I don't think China will abandon Russia. Neither will India. From its own sort of historic neutrality point of view, right? But I do think that the longer this continues, I think the West can always reinvent itself in ways that Russia just is not able to, not be able to. So I'm with you on that point. Yes.
Yeah, the real art of the diplomacies is to put enough pressure on to get a peace, and not so much pressure that it completely antagonizes the other person. I mean, and you don't want to get in the game of escalation. I mean, because that's uncontrollable. You have two very heavily nuclear armed forces, and you simply don't want to get into that territory where the threat of using nuclear weapons, even tactical, especially tactical nuclear weapons, becomes a reality. And that, I'm afraid, is where the European diplomacy, and particularly the British, have been totally insensitive. They've always said, oh, that's just bluff, when Putin says he might use nuclear weapons. Oh, that's bluff. We go on as though, we have the complete hand, and we're going to make sure that the Ukrainians win and that there's a regime change in Moscow. And this is the fantasy of old, clapped-out imperialists. I mean, they think, oh, this is a moment for Britain again to enter the great game which it played with Russia in the 19th century, and the British flag, and say you get onto an aircraft carrier in Asia and say, this is where we're with you. I mean, it's all fantasy. I hate it. I absolutely hate it.
So, Lord Skidelsky, before Lasha will take us to the kind of the issue of Georgia and in this very surrounding, I would like to ask you about the Trump's policy in continuation of what you have already said. I think, what do you think about the tariffs and secondary sanctions? I mean, does it can it help U.S. economy somehow? Or the main aim for that kind of stuff, I mean, for the tariffs and for the sanctions, is a kind of creating the artificial crises to bring counterparts to a deal. What is the main goal for this rhetoric and for these actions?
Well, I've always been against economic sanctions. I don't think they've ever worked and achieved their goal. If you actually look at what their results have been compared to what they said they were trying to do with them, there's no comparison. When sanctions were put on against Russia following Maidan, but then more so after 2022, government ministers, what they said was the aim of these sanctions is to degrade Russia's capacity to wage war, and therefore basically prevent it from waging war, or making its defeat more likely. It hasn't happened that way. It might in the long run, in the very long run, but long after the issue of the battlefield has been resolved. So they don't work, sanctions, unless they're imposed by the whole world and cover absolutely everything. And the state being sanctioned is quite a small state. Now, in no other circumstances do sanctions work, and they are simply a way of letting off moral indignation. We can't do anything, therefore we have sanctions. Because we want to show our moral disgust. The problem with that sort of approach is it rules out diplomacy, because sanctions are an alternative to diplomacy. Sanctions are an act of war. They're part of a war strategy, not a diplomatic settlement strategy, and that's where the contradiction lies. On the question of tariffs, I mean, there's a contradiction. Tariffs have an economic purpose, which is to rescue American home industry, if you like, from being taken over by cheap labor. And they also have a geopolitical purpose, which is to bring pressure on countries to sort of, do whatever America wants it to do. But those two purposes contradict. And you can see the contradiction in the case of China, particularly. America, on the one hand, wants to cooperate with China, and on the other hand, it threatens them with sanctions. You have to just abolish sanctions. You've got to say, we don't want any more economic sanctions. They're a failed instrument of war. We're going to not have any more, and we're going to get rid of what we have as soon as possible. That's my view as to what should happen.
Okay, thank you so much. Lasha, we are somehow running out of the time, so I'm sure you have the questions regarding the Georgia situation, please.
Yes, I actually want, we all do, obviously, get a feel from you on what you think about the South Caucasus under the current environment in the international system, what the West has done, let's just say since 2003, briefly, when the Rose Revolution took place, and this extremely sort of the extremes of neoconservative agenda and the freedom agenda sort of entered the region, making Georgia out to be this a future a member of NATO, so, and then we all know where that led us to 2008 war, when Russia invaded Georgia as a result as a way to prevent that narrative from becoming a reality. But be that as it may, sort of a overall general strategy, even your native, England, we all know what the strategy of the United Kingdom has always been towards the region, to basically keep Russia out of Asia. India, obviously, being the sort of crown jewel that sort of was looked at through the paranoid strategic prism that Russia was going to take India, the great game. We all know this history. And I feel like today there are signs that, if history does not repeat itself, it certainly rhymes. There are signs that, England, UK, along with the United States, sort of tries to, hasn't abandoned that whole, like you said, sort of this imperial psychology of weakening Russia from its sort of soft underbelly. So when the Bolsheviks came to power, it was keeping the sick man of Europe, right? The Turkish sort of empire out of the region, and controlling warm waters, or controlling the entire region in the South Caucasus, moving to Central Asia, East Asia, so forth. And now it's Russia again. What is your take on this? Do you think that mentality still drives the foreign policy of the United Kingdom towards the region and towards Russia?
It still twitches. It rhymes, as you say, but it's the reflex. As soon as you get into this part of the world again, these old reflexes come out. And it's not Britain alongside the United States. It's Britain, sort of as a puppet of the United States. But one of those phrases is Britain playing Greece. Britain playing Greece to America's Rome. But Greece wasn't part of the American military, part of the Roman military establishment, and Britain still feels it can make a military contribution, a subordinate military contribution to a greater American effort. Now, on the South Caucasus, again, it's the same thing as with Ukraine, I think, isn't it? It's the West trying to thrust into this bit of the Russian borders, as they were, and Russia trying to maintain its buffer state. South Caucasus is a buffer, Ukraine is a buffer, and something we haven't mentioned, but it'll surely be part of some final idea, Belarus as a buffer. Now, it's interesting no one talks about Belarus because we can't actually talk about anything that isn't frontline news. But the point is, what happens after Lukashenko dies? I mean, there's strong anti-Russian movement in Belarus. Do we then promise Belarus membership of NATO, membership of the European Union? How does Russia react to that? And this might be in 2 or 3 years, only 2 or 3 years down the road. I think the present, it seems to me the present Georgian leadership, the Dream Party, Kavalashvili, that seems to me right. They want to negotiate the issues of Abkhazia and South Ossetia with Russia. I personally think that the way you do this, when you have one state, but 2 or 3 different nations within the state, the civilized way forward is to have a federal system, a sufficiently decentralized system to preserve the autonomy and identity of the minority regions. Otherwise, you either have to separate or liquidate, or have big population transfers, as I think happened in the case, was it Abkhazia expelled 100,000 Georgians, I think. So you have all these ways of settling these issues, but the civilized way is to say, okay, we are going to have a fairly decentralized federal system. The reason why the nationalists in Ukraine don't want that system is that it makes them weaker. It makes the state weaker. And they want a strong state, strong nationalist state, in a position to fight Russia whenever they need to. And you can't do that with these more within a federal structure. And that's why Europe also is not yet in any way is not yet a state, because it has a very weak center. And federal systems, not all of them, but they tend to have weak centers because they have to give a lot of the parts autonomy. So I think, I think Georgia's doing absolutely right at the moment, and it shouldn't simply go along the Saakashvili route. But that's a foreigner making a comment on an internal matter. I shouldn't really.
Please, Lasha, before we conclude our conversation, your comments or your additional question.
Well, I think the Saakashvili route, I completely agree with you on. Strategically, I think it was a disaster. I think the country went from bad to worse in terms of Russia recognizing South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states, which is ridiculous in and of itself. But be that as it may, we see that geopolitics matters, national security interests matter, and that's all that matters, really. So that's why Russia did this, and without going back to the Soviet history, why these borders were so entrenched and divided, and that's a different topic altogether. But to answer your question, to comment on your point of Ukraine and nationalists there, yeah, of course they want the cohesiveness of their state, hoping that sort of full sovereignty of Ukraine would eventually lead them to NATO. But Ukraine was sovereign just fine, and NATO was nowhere to be seen before 2014. And so the idea that there was some sort of a determinism or necessity that NATO would incorporate Ukraine into its membership was a chimera to begin with. I think it was all invented, where the halls of power in the West understood perfectly well that Russia wasn't going to. This just wasn't going to work out. Russia.
But why didn't Putin understand that? You see, he gave. And he must have known that there was no real way in which Ukraine could be allowed into NATO as it was in any near time span. So why did he invade nevertheless? That's where I think he miscalculated. You see, I don't simply blame the West for everything.
Oh,
of course not. I think there was a big miscalculation. And when Trump talks about an unnecessary war, I think he means two things. It was unnecessary from the West's point of view, but it was also unnecessary from the Russian point of view.
Although there has been a pushback to that point, Lord, because when you have the whole, Putin was upset with the idea that, strategically speaking, Ukraine was being armed and trained. Ukraine's army was being trained by NATO.
I agree that. I accept that.
That was simply unacceptable.
I accept that.
Yeah, there was ad hoc sort of turning this country into NATO, an informal NATO member.
Yeah.
Endless training of its troops and military. And Putin actually, I'm not defending Putin as a Georgian. I cannot bring myself to do that. I'm just trying to sort of be as objective as possible. And I think George will agree with me on this, that, Putin looked at it as a direct security threat to the Russian Federation. When those first two tranches of NATO expansion took place, Putin was really, the collective Kremlin, all right, the Kremlin apparatus was trying collectively to dissuade, Washington specifically. To a lesser extent, Brussels, not to do this.
Yeah, could I interject? Your point about it started with naivety and then became deliberate. I'm not sure how naive it was at the beginning even. I think they thought they'd won, the West, and they were going to get the fruits of their victory. There were always very strong anti-Russian lobbyists in Washington. In the CIA, there was the old Ukrainian nationalist lobby, which a lot of them, some of them had actually supported Bandera in the Second World War. So there was all that. And so there was a project, I think, as well as naivety. I think it was there from the very start, but the project bit of it became much more prominent by 2004 with the Maidan uprising, which was financed, organized, certainly helped a great deal by the Americans and the CIA and the State Department. So
2014, you mean?
I mean 2014, so sorry, yes. Well, I can see then there was a huge provocation. Nevertheless, I would still argue that a first-class statesman would have said, okay, look, let's try for something better without going to war. Let's try. But I don't think he tried hard enough. So that's where I blame Putin. But the West has a huge responsibility for all this.
So Lord Skidelsky, to finalize, to summarize our conversation, I would like to go back to the very first question regarding the shifting from the unipolarity towards the multipolarity, and all this stuff Trump is doing right now. So recently, it was days ago that the news came out that Narendra Modi is going to visit China at the end of August to participate on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. And also India and Russia signed the agreement regarding the further cooperation in trade in different fields. So what is your feeling? So is that the kind of sign that Russia, China, and India, they are getting ready for the new multipolarity, for the new multipolar world, and their aim is to prepare the so-called global south for this multipolarity, and they are joining efforts against the Western influence on the globe.
Yeah, I think multipolarity was always going to happen with the weakening of the United States. The only question is whether it would happen peacefully or violently. Unfortunately, the policy of the West has sort of created the potential for quite a violent conflict between the multipolar bits of the planet and the Western bits. I mean, for example, in the BRICS are creating an alternative international payment system. They're constructing an alternative economic space. So in a way, they're recreating in economics and in military terms, the divided world, which really we thought we'd escape. So I think the question is exactly what you say. Is there a peaceful way to multipolarity which preserves the idea of an open trading system, that preserves the idea of a United Nations sort of government, if you like, settling these issues? Or do we move towards an era of two armed blocs again, with the risk, huge risk of war, because there are no rules of engagement at the moment? At the end of the Cold War, they did work out a modus vivendi between the two sides. We're drifting into that situation. The modus vivendi can look like, and I don't think it's necessary. There shouldn't be any ideological conflict any longer, but that we invent one because it's freedom versus autocracy. So I'm not an optimist. I'm not an optimist in the end. I think we're going to go through some very, very, very rough and unpleasant moments before we sort all this out.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. Lasha, if you have any comment on these regards, we exploded a lot of time
just
of
very
Lord
briefly.
Skidelsky. Yeah, please.
Sure, just very briefly. I think in reference to India, India will always act based on its traditional sort of policy of neutrality, starting since the 40s. I think it was, since its refusal to participate in the Cold War, ideological battle, strategic battle, and then it very wisely sort of pursued and stuck with this perpetual neutrality, without burning bridges either with the West or the East, so to speak.
I agree.
And today, when I think there was in the last 48 hours, Trump administration's pressure on India on tariffs, on egging them against their own interests by telling them not to buy energy resources from Russia, and many other things. In terms of geoeconomics, I think India will not calmly succumb to these demands, and we are seeing it as we speak. There have been already a bunch of articles written about this, and commentary has been made about this in the last day or two. I think if India sees this sort of strategic triangle with China and Russia, I think it will take that opportunity. It will not step out as a lone wolf in fight against the United States. It needs South Caucasus, it needs Central Asia, it needs Iran. Iran is very strategically necessary country for India, and I don't think I think that India and Modi, sees this as a only within the collective sort of strategic, only being a member of this strategic calculus with China and Russia that it can they will be able to resist pressure from the collective West, and particularly from Washington. So I think India will have dual policy, will maintain its traditional neutrality, but it will also ally, so to speak, with China and Russia to overall resist the collective West. That's my view on that.
So, Lord Skidelsky, if you have any short comment.
No, I think we've covered the ground. The only short comment I would have is don't forget Belarus.
Yeah, definitely. You're right. You're extremely right. So, Lord Skidelsky, thank you so much. It was great to have you on program. Thanks a lot for your time and for your very, very interesting insights. So, Lasha, thank you so much for joining me for this program and for organizing this very interesting conversation with Lord Skidelsky.